The journey toward emotional invulnerability begins with understanding the architecture of human emotional vulnerability. Every individual carries within them a complex network of emotional triggers, insecurities, and defensive mechanisms developed throughout their lifetime. These psychological structures, while serving protective functions in some contexts, create predictable weaknesses that can be exploited by those who understand their operation. The process of constructing emotional armor requires first conducting a comprehensive audit of one's own psychological vulnerabilities. This involves identifying every emotional button that others have successfully pressed in the past, cataloging the specific circumstances that generate strong emotional responses, and mapping the connection between external triggers and internal reactions. Most people avoid this level of self-examination because it requires confronting uncomfortable truths about their psychological makeup. However, this discomfort is precisely what makes the process so valuable. By willingly exploring these dark corners of the psyche, one removes the power others hold through unexplored vulnerabilities. Consider the case of a successful corporate executive who discovered that his primary emotional vulnerability centered around questions of intellectual competence. Throughout his career, he had reacted strongly whenever anyone questioned his intelligence or expertise, often responding in ways that ultimately undermined his position. By systematically examining these reactions, he identified the childhood experiences that had created this sensitivity: a critical father who had consistently questioned his academic performance and a series of early academic failures that had never been properly processed. Armed with this self-knowledge, the executive began constructing specific defenses against this vulnerability. He developed standard responses to intellectual challenges that appeared confident while revealing nothing about his internal state. More importantly, he began deliberately placing himself in situations where his expertise would be questioned, gradually building tolerance for these triggers until they no longer generated significant emotional responses. Within 6 months, colleagues began commenting on his newfound unflappability in challenging situations. The construction of emotional armor follows several key principles. First, one must develop what psychologists call emotional granularity, the ability to identify and categorize emotional states with precision. Most people experience emotions as vague, overwhelming forces that seem to arise spontaneously. The individual seeking emotional untouchability learns to dissect these experiences into component parts, understanding exactly which elements of a situation generate which specific emotional responses. This granular understanding creates the foundation for emotional regulation. Rather than being overwhelmed by a general sense of upset or anger, one can identify the precise triggers and respond to each element strategically. For instance, what might initially present as anger toward a colleague might actually consist of frustration at their incompetence, anxiety about project deadlines, and wounded pride at being associated with their failure. Each of these components requires a different response strategy. The second principle involves developing what might be called emotional compartmentalization. This technique involves creating psychological barriers between different aspects of one's identity and emotional investment. The goal is to ensure that disruption or attack in one area cannot cascade into other areas of psychological functioning. A master of this technique might simultaneously experience a devastating personal rejection while maintaining complete professional effectiveness, or suffer significant financial losses while preserving emotional stability in family relationships. This compartmentalization requires practical implementation through specific mental exercises. One effective approach involves creating detailed mental maps of different life domains: professional identity, personal relationships, physical health, financial security, creative pursuits, and so forth. For each domain, one develops separate emotional investment strategies and defensive protocols. When one area comes under attack, the practitioner can consciously shift psychological resources to other domains, maintaining overall stability even while absorbing significant damage in a specific area. The third principle centers on developing strategic emotional investment. Most people invest emotionally in outcomes beyond their control, creating vulnerabilities that others can exploit by threatening those outcomes. The emotionally untouchable individual learns to invest only in processes they can control, while maintaining apparent investment in outcomes for social and strategic purposes. This distinction proves crucial in practical applications. Consider a business negotiation where one party appears deeply invested in reaching a specific agreement. If this investment is genuine, the other party can exploit it by threatening to walk away, knowing that the emotional attachment will likely lead to concessions. However, if the apparent investment is strategic, maintained for negotiating advantage while the individual remains genuinely detached from the specific outcome, the threat loses its power. The development of strategic emotional investment requires extensive practice in outcome independence. This involves training oneself to derive satisfaction from the quality of one's performance rather than from specific results. A sales professional might become emotionally untouchable by focusing entirely on the excellence of their presentation and negotiation technique, while remaining genuinely indifferent to whether any particular client signs a contract. This indifference, paradoxically, often improves results because it eliminates the desperate energy that sophisticated clients can detect and exploit. The fourth principle involves mastering emotional mirroring and manipulation. While constructing one's own emotional armor, one must simultaneously develop the ability to read and influence others' emotional states. This creates the asymmetric relationship that provides strategic advantage. The practitioner remains emotionally protected while gaining increasing influence over others' psychological states. Emotional mirroring begins with developing acute sensitivity to others' emotional expressions, both conscious and unconscious. This involves training oneself to notice micro-expressions, changes in vocal tone, body language shifts, and other subtle indicators of emotional state. Most people broadcast their emotional condition constantly through these subtle signals, but few individuals have trained themselves to read them accurately. The advanced practitioner learns not only to read these signals but to generate them strategically. By mirroring someone's emotional state, one can create artificial rapport and trust. By subtly shifting one's own emotional expression, one can guide others toward desired emotional states. This technique requires extensive practice to avoid detection. The mirroring must appear natural and unconscious, rather than calculated and manipulative. The fifth principle centers on developing psychological immunity to common manipulation techniques. Just as the body develops immunity to diseases through exposure and defensive preparation, the mind can develop resistance to psychological manipulation through understanding and practice. This involves studying the standard techniques others use to generate emotional responses and building specific defenses against each approach. Common manipulation techniques include guilt induction, fear appeals, social pressure, false urgency, artificial scarcity, and ego attacks. Each technique operates through specific psychological mechanisms, and each can be neutralized through appropriate defensive strategies. Guilt induction, for instance, relies on the target accepting responsibility for the manipulator's emotional state. By maintaining clear boundaries around personal responsibility, one can remain unmoved by guilt appeals while still appearing appropriately concerned. The construction of psychological immunity requires deliberate exposure to manipulation attempts under controlled conditions. This might involve practicing with trusted allies who agree to attempt various manipulation techniques, allowing the practitioner to develop defensive responses without suffering real consequences from failed defenses. Over time, these defenses become automatic, creating genuine immunity to most common manipulation attempts. The sixth principle involves developing what might be called emotional aikido, the ability to redirect others' emotional energy rather than absorbing it. Traditional aikido involves using an attacker's force against them, redirecting their energy rather than meeting it with opposing force. Emotional aikido operates on similar principles, allowing practitioners to remain untouched by emotional attacks while turning that energy back on the attacker. Consider a situation where someone attempts to generate guilt or shame through accusations of selfishness or insensitivity. Rather than defending against these accusations or absorbing the intended emotional impact, the practitioner might redirect by expressing concern about what could have prompted such harsh words, thereby shifting focus to the accuser's emotional state and motivations. This redirection often creates more psychological impact on the attacker than any direct response could achieve. The seventh principle centers on mastering strategic vulnerability display. While the goal is emotional untouchability, appearing completely invulnerable can actually create strategic disadvantages. Others may become suspicious, resentful, or defensive when interacting with someone who seems completely emotionally armored. Therefore, the advanced practitioner learns to display calculated vulnerabilities that serve strategic purposes while protecting genuinely sensitive areas. These strategic vulnerabilities serve multiple functions. They make others comfortable by providing apparent emotional access points, they can be used to generate sympathy or support when beneficial, and they provide false targets for those who might otherwise probe for genuine weaknesses. The key lies in ensuring these displayed vulnerabilities are conscious choices rather than actual emotional exposure points. The construction of emotional armor represents the foundational work necessary for all advanced psychological strategies. Without genuine emotional invulnerability, attempts to manipulate others' emotions will often backfire, as the practitioner's own emotional investment will be detected and exploited. However, with proper emotional armor in place, one gains the psychological freedom necessary to implement more advanced techniques for influencing and controlling others' emotional states and ego structures. The process typically requires 6 to 12 months of dedicated work to achieve basic proficiency, and several years to reach true mastery. However, the benefits begin appearing almost immediately as one develops greater emotional stability and resistance to others' manipulation attempts. The individual who has successfully constructed emotional armor finds themselves operating from a position of psychological strength that transforms every human interaction into an opportunity for strategic advantage. Part 2: Advanced Psychological Warfare and Ego Destruction. With emotional armor firmly in place, the practitioner can begin implementing advanced techniques for psychological influence and ego destruction. This phase requires moving beyond defensive positioning to active psychological warfare, employing sophisticated strategies designed to systematically undermine others' psychological stability while maintaining complete emotional detachment from the outcomes. The foundation of effective ego destruction lies in understanding that every individual's sense of self rests on a surprisingly small number of core beliefs about their identity, worth, and capabilities. These beliefs often develop during childhood and adolescence, becoming so fundamental to psychological functioning that the individual rarely examines them consciously. By identifying and systematically challenging these core beliefs, one can create profound psychological disruption that extends far beyond the immediate interaction. The process begins with psychological reconnaissance, gathering detailed intelligence about the target's self-concept, insecurities, aspirations, and defensive mechanisms. This intelligence gathering must be subtle and comprehensive, as premature attacks based on incomplete information often alert the target to the manipulation and trigger defensive responses that make further influence more difficult. Consider the approach used by a master manipulator in a corporate environment who had identified a rival for an executive position. Rather than engaging in obvious competition, she spent months gathering intelligence about her rival's psychological profile. Through casual conversations, observation of his interactions with others, and careful analysis of his professional presentations, she identified several key vulnerabilities: and deep need for intellectual validation stemming from academic insecurities, a tendency toward perfectionism that created anxiety under pressure, and a strong attachment to being perceived as morally superior to others. Armed with this intelligence, she began implementing a systematic campaign designed to exploit each vulnerability while maintaining perfect deniability. She would ask seemingly innocent questions in meetings that highlighted gaps in his knowledge, always framed as seeking his expertise but structured to expose areas where his understanding was incomplete. She would create time pressures around projects he was managing, knowing his perfectionist tendencies would generate internal stress that would eventually manifest in visible performance issues. Most devastatingly, she would occasionally make subtle ethical compromises in his presence, then praise his moral standards, creating internal conflict between his self-image and his failure to speak up. The campaign took 8 months to reach completion, during which time her rival's confidence visibly deteriorated. He became increasingly defensive in meetings, began second-guessing decisions that previously came naturally, and started displaying the kind of anxious behaviors that senior leadership interprets as lacking executive presence. When the promotion decision was made, it appeared to everyone, including the rival himself, that he had simply demonstrated his lack of readiness for increased responsibility. This example illustrates several key principles of advanced psychological warfare. First, the most effective attacks target the gap between how individuals see themselves and how they fear others might see them. Second, successful ego destruction often involves helping targets destroy themselves rather than attacking them directly. Third, the best psychological warfare maintains perfect deniability. Observers, including the targets themselves, cannot identify specific manipulative actions. The systematic destruction of another's ego requires understanding the specific architecture of their self-concept. Most individuals construct their identity around several core themes: competence in valued areas, moral superiority or uniqueness, desirability to others, control over their environment, and significance or importance. Each of these themes offers opportunities for subtle undermining through carefully calibrated psychological pressure. Competence-based identity proves particularly vulnerable to strategic questioning and subtle demonstrations of superior knowledge or skill. The key lies in avoiding direct challenges, which trigger defensive responses, while creating situations where the target's limitations become apparent to themselves and others. This might involve asking questions that reveal gaps in understanding, introducing concepts or techniques that highlight their outdated knowledge, or creating performance comparisons that subtly emphasize their relative weakness. The approach requires sophisticated timing and delivery. Direct challenges create martyrs, subtle erosion creates self-doubt. The goal is to plant seeds of uncertainty that will grow through the target's own psychological processes. A single well-timed question that highlights a knowledge gap can generate weeks of internal anxiety as the target begins questioning other areas of their supposed expertise. Moral superiority represents another common foundation of identity, particularly among individuals who derive self-worth from their ethical standards or social consciousness. These individuals can be psychologically devastated through techniques that highlight the inconsistencies between their stated values and their actual behavior. The approach involves creating situations where ethical compromises become necessary for practical goals, then subtly highlighting the contradictions. The most effective approach involves creating no-win scenarios where any choice the target makes can be framed as ethically problematic. For instance, a manager who prides themselves on treating all employees fairly might be placed in situations where fairness to one group necessarily creates unfairness to another. By consistently creating such dilemmas, one can gradually erode their confidence in their moral judgment while maintaining the appearance of simply presenting business realities. Desirability-based identity offers rich opportunities for psychological manipulation, as most people derive significant self-worth from believing others find them attractive, interesting, or valuable. This vulnerability can be exploited through strategic applications of social proof, subtle exclusion, and calculated displays of disinterest or criticism. The approach begins with establishing apparent value and interest, creating emotional investment in one's approval. Once this investment is established, one can begin implementing cycles of validation and withdrawal, gradually training the target to work increasingly hard for increasingly sparse positive feedback. This creates an addiction-like psychological dynamic where the target becomes emotionally dependent on the manipulator's approval while receiving less and less of it. Control-based identity proves vulnerable to systematic creation of unpredictability and chaos in areas where the target expects to maintain influence. This might involve subtly undermining their authority with subordinates, creating unexpected complications in projects they manage, or introducing variables they cannot control into situations where they expect to dominate. The key lies in ensuring the chaos appears random rather than targeted, preventing the target from identifying and addressing the source of their loss of control. As their attempts to reassert control consistently fail, they begin experiencing learned helplessness that can extend far beyond the original area of manipulation. Significance-based identity can be eroded through strategic minimization of the target's contributions and achievements. This requires subtle techniques rather than obvious dismissal, as direct attacks on someone's significance often backfire by generating sympathy from observers. Instead, one might consistently redirect conversations away from their achievements, give credit for their ideas to others, or frame their contributions as less important than they actually were. The advanced practitioner learns to combine these approaches synergistically, creating campaigns that attack multiple aspects of identity simultaneously while maintaining perfect deniability. The target experiences increasing psychological distress but cannot identify specific behaviors to object to, as each individual action appears reasonable and innocuous. Perhaps the most sophisticated technique involves what might be called reality distortion, gradually altering the target's perception of situations and relationships through consistent application of subtle psychological pressure. This involves systematically contradicting their perceptions in minor ways, questioning their memory of events, and creating situations where their judgment appears flawed. The technique requires enormous patience and consistency, as it works through cumulative effect rather than dramatic single actions. Over time, the target begins questioning their own perceptions and judgment, creating psychological vulnerability that can be exploited in multiple ways. They become increasingly dependent on others for reality testing, making them susceptible to further manipulation by anyone willing to provide apparent certainty. The implementation of these techniques requires maintaining perfect emotional detachment throughout the process. Any emotional investment in the target's destruction can cloud judgment and lead to mistakes that expose the manipulation. The practitioner must view the entire process as an intellectual exercise, remaining genuinely indifferent to the target's suffering while maintaining whatever emotional facade serves strategic purposes. This detachment serves practical as well as strategic purposes. Emotional investment in another's destruction often indicates unresolved psychological issues in the manipulator, creating vulnerabilities that sophisticated targets can identify and exploit. Moreover, genuine indifference to the target's well-being allows for more precise calibration of psychological pressure, as the practitioner can adjust techniques based purely on effectiveness rather than emotional satisfaction. The most successful practitioners often report that their targets eventually thank them for the psychological destruction, having been led to believe that their resulting insights and changes represent personal growth rather than manipulation. This outcome represents the pinnacle of psychological warfare. The target not only fails to recognize the manipulation but actually feels grateful for the experience. However, the implementation of these techniques carries significant risks that must be carefully managed. Targets who recognize the manipulation can become dangerous enemies, particularly if they possess their own psychological sophistication. More importantly, the consistent practice of ego destruction can gradually erode the practitioner's own capacity for genuine human connection, creating social isolation and psychological emptiness that may not become apparent until significant damage has occurred. The most successful long-term practitioners learn to compartmentalize these techniques, deploying them selectively against specific targets while maintaining genuine relationships in other areas of their lives. This compartmentalization prevents the psychological toxicity of consistent manipulation from contaminating all human connections while preserving the strategic advantages these techniques provide in competitive environments. The mastery of ego destruction through psychological warfare represents the culmination of Machiavellian emotional strategy. When combined with genuine emotional invulnerability, these techniques create extraordinary power over others while maintaining complete personal protection from psychological attack. However, this power must be wielded with extreme care, as the long-term consequences of consistent psychological manipulation can prove as destructive to the practitioner as to their targets. Part 3: Strategic Implementation and Long-Term Psychological Dominance. The final phase of mastering Machiavellian emotional warfare involves developing sophisticated systems for implementing these techniques in real-world environments while building sustainable psychological dominance over extended periods. This requires moving beyond individual manipulation tactics to create comprehensive strategic frameworks that maintain influence across multiple relationships and contexts simultaneously. The foundation of strategic implementation lies in understanding that psychological dominance functions as an ecosystem rather than a collection of isolated techniques. Each relationship and influence dynamic connects to others, creating networks of psychological leverage that can be orchestrated to produce compound effects far greater than the sum of individual manipulations. The master practitioner learns to view their social environment as a complex system of interconnected psychological relationships, each of which can be influenced to create desired outcomes in others. Consider the approach developed by a successful political operative who had mastered these principles across decades of campaign work. Rather than focusing on direct influence over any single target, she created what she termed psychological architecture, carefully constructed networks of relationships and information flows designed to shape multiple individuals' perceptions and decisions simultaneously. Her system involved identifying key influence nodes within any organization or social group, establishing psychological dominance over these individuals, then using their influence to shape others' behavior indirectly. The process began with comprehensive mapping of influence relationships within the target environment. She would spend weeks identifying who influenced whom, what psychological vulnerabilities existed within key relationships, and how information and emotional states propagated through the social network. This intelligence formed the foundation for strategic interventions designed to create cascading psychological effects throughout the system. Her most sophisticated campaigns involved simultaneously implementing different psychological strategies across multiple targets, with each intervention designed to reinforce the others. She might undermine one individual's confidence in their judgment while simultaneously positioning herself as a source of clarity and certainty for their colleagues. As the first target's effectiveness declined, the others would naturally turn to her for guidance, creating expanding influence that appeared to develop organically rather than through manipulation. The key insight underlying this approach involves recognizing that most individuals exist within psychological ecosystems where their self-concept and emotional stability depend heavily on feedback from others. By gaining influence over the sources of this feedback, one can shape target psychological states without direct intervention, maintaining perfect deniability while achieving profound influence over their behavior and decision-making. The implementation of systematic psychological dominance requires developing what might be called emotional portfolio management, the strategic deployment of different relationship types and influence strategies across one's social environment to maximize overall psychological leverage while minimizing risk of exposure or counterattack. This involves categorizing relationships based on their strategic value and implementing appropriate influence strategies for each category. Primary strategic relationships represent individuals who possess significant power or influence that can advance one's objectives. These relationships require the most sophisticated approach, combining strategic emotional investment with carefully calibrated displays of value and competence. The goal involves becoming psychologically indispensable to these individuals while maintaining complete emotional independence from their approval or support. The approach begins with comprehensive psychological profiling to identify each target's core emotional needs, fears, and decision-making patterns. Most powerful individuals operate from surprisingly predictable psychological scripts, often driven by insecurities or unmet needs that their success has failed to address. By identifying and fulfilling these psychological needs more effectively than others, one can establish profound influence that extends far beyond the immediate relationship. Secondary relationships encompass individuals who lack direct power but possess access to information, influence over others, or strategic value as intelligence sources. These relationships require lighter touch approaches focused on generating loyalty and trust rather than dependence. The goal involves creating a network of individuals who volunteer information and support without recognizing their strategic value to the manipulator. Tertiary relationships include all other social connections that might provide future strategic value or represent potential threats to one's influence network. These relationships require maintenance-level engagement designed to preserve future options while preventing the development of hostility or suspicion that could complicate future strategic initiatives. The management of this relationship portfolio requires sophisticated systems for tracking psychological states, influence dynamics, and strategic opportunities across multiple individuals simultaneously. The most successful practitioners develop comprehensive databases containing detailed psychological profiles, interaction histories, and strategic assessments for every significant relationship in their environment. These systems enable the identification of emerging opportunities and threats that might not be apparent through casual observation. For instance, changes in one individual's psychological state might create vulnerabilities that can be exploited to gain influence over someone else in their network. Similarly, shifts in relationship dynamics between other parties might create opportunities for strategic positioning that advances long-term objectives. The advanced practitioner learns to orchestrate these relationships like a conductor managing a complex symphony, with each interaction timed and calibrated to produce desired effects in the broader system. This might involve providing strategic support to one individual during a crisis, knowing that their gratitude will translate into future influence, while simultaneously positioning oneself as the obvious successor to another individual whose position is becoming untenable due to carefully orchestrated psychological pressure. Perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of long-term psychological dominance involves creating what might be termed psychological dependencies, where targets become genuinely unable to function effectively without the manipulator's support and guidance. This goes far beyond simple emotional manipulation to create structural changes in how targets process information and make decisions. The process begins with gradually positioning oneself as the primary source of clarity and insight for increasingly important aspects of the target's life or work. This involves consistently providing valuable analysis, solutions, and guidance while subtly undermining their confidence in their own judgment. Over time, the target begins automatically deferring to the manipulator's perspective on important matters, even when the manipulator is not present. The creation of psychological dependency requires extreme patience and consistency, as the process typically takes months or years to reach completion. However, once established, these dependencies prove remarkably durable and resistant to outside influence. The target has essentially outsourced critical aspects of their decision-making to the manipulator, making them highly vulnerable to influence while often remaining completely unaware of their dependence. The maintenance of long-term psychological dominance requires constant adaptation to changing circumstances and evolving target psychology. Individuals learn and grow over time, developing new defenses and changing their psychological patterns in response to life experiences. The successful practitioner must continuously update their approach to maintain effectiveness while avoiding detection or counterattack. This adaptation requires sophisticated psychological insight and strategic flexibility. Techniques that prove highly effective in one context or time period may become counterproductive as targets develop greater psychological sophistication or as their life circumstances change. The master practitioner maintains extensive repertoires of influence techniques and can shift between approaches seamlessly based on changing conditions. Perhaps most importantly, the practitioner must develop systems for managing the psychological toll of consistent manipulation and emotional detachment. The long-term practice of these techniques can create profound changes in one's own psychology, potentially leading to genuine inability to form authentic emotional connections or derive satisfaction from non-manipulative relationships. The most successful long-term practitioners address this challenge through careful compartmentalization and periodic psychological maintenance. They maintain areas of their lives where genuine emotional connection and vulnerability are permitted, often with individuals who exist outside their professional or strategic environments. This compartmentalization prevents the psychological toxicity of consistent manipulation from contaminating all relationships while preserving their capacity for authentic human experience. Additionally, many develop philosophical frameworks that provide meaning and justification for their activities beyond simple personal advantage. They might view themselves as natural leaders helping others make better decisions, or as social architects creating order and efficiency in chaotic environments. These frameworks provide psychological protection against the potential negative consequences of recognizing the full extent of their manipulative behavior. The ultimate objective of strategic psychological dominance extends beyond winning individual conflicts or advancing specific goals. The true master seeks to create environments where their influence becomes so thoroughly integrated into the social and decision-making structures that their objectives advance automatically without requiring conscious intervention. They become the invisible hand that shapes others' choices while remaining completely protected from recognition or retaliation. This level of influence requires transcending individual manipulation tactics to create what might be called psychological infrastructure, systematic arrangements of relationships, information flows, and influence dynamics that serve their interests regardless of changing circumstances or personnel. Like physical infrastructure, psychological infrastructure operates largely invisibly, shaping behavior and outcomes through structural influence rather than obvious intervention. The construction of such infrastructure represents the pinnacle of Machiavellian psychological strategy. It requires decades of patient work, extraordinary psychological insight, and the ability to think strategically across extended time horizons. However, those who achieve this level of influence often find themselves wielding power that extends far beyond what would be possible through conventional approaches, all while maintaining the appearance of being helpful, supportive colleagues or friends. The mastery of strategic psychological dominance transforms every human interaction into an opportunity for expanding influence while maintaining complete emotional protection. It represents the ultimate synthesis of Machiavellian political philosophy with modern psychological understanding, creating capabilities that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations but which become achievable through systematic application of these principles. However, the pursuit of such power carries profound responsibilities and risks that extend beyond the immediate practitioner. The widespread application of these techniques could fundamentally alter the nature of human social interaction, potentially creating environments where authentic emotional connection becomes increasingly rare and every relationship exists primarily as a vehicle for manipulation. The individual who masters these capabilities must carefully consider not only their personal objectives but also their broader impact on the social environments they influence. The choice to pursue emotional untouchability and psychological dominance ultimately represents a fundamental decision about how to exist in relationship to other human beings. It offers extraordinary power and protection from emotional vulnerability, but potentially at the cost of authentic connection and genuine meaning. The wise practitioner approaches these techniques with full awareness of both their potential and their limitations, using them judiciously in service of carefully considered objectives rather than as a blanket approach to all human interaction. In the end, the art of becoming emotionally untouchable while destroying others' egos through strategic mind games represents one of the most powerful skill sets available for navigating competitive social environments. When properly mastered and implemented, these techniques provide virtually unassailable psychological advantages while maintaining complete protection from others' manipulation attempts. However, like all forms of power, they must be wielded with wisdom, restraint, and careful consideration of their long-term consequences for both the practitioner and the broader human community. The individual who fully integrates these principles into their life approach will find themselves operating from a position of psychological strength and strategic advantage that transforms every human interaction into an opportunity for advancing their objectives. They will have achieved the rare combination of emotional invulnerability and psychological influence that represents the highest achievement of Machiavellian interpersonal strategy. Whether this achievement ultimately serves their deepest interests and contributes to their genuine fulfillment remains a question that each practitioner must answer for themselves.